Periodic, intense bouts of intermittent fasting are going to be very effective when it comes down to isolating visceral fat. And the reason behind that is pretty simple, at least when you look at the research. Our visceral fat contains a high amount of beta-3 adrenergic receptors, which respond really well to the adrenaline spikes that occur as a result of fasting. You see, we can look at a few different things. For one, there was a study that was published in the journal Metabolism that found that we have more of those beta-3 adrenergic receptors in our visceral fat. Our visceral fat is the fat that is underneath our subcutaneous fat. We don't typically see it. Okay, unless someone has a big pot belly that protrudes or anything like that. You don't always see it, okay, but it's still there. And if you have a lot of visceral fat, then it can contribute to a fatty liver because it's so close to the liver. It can contribute to insulin issues where you're not able to process carbohydrates as well. Anyway, the list goes on, not to mention the leaking of inflammatory cytokines. But the reason that fasting has such a powerful effect is because fasting spikes your adrenaline. Fasting spikes catecholamines, but only if it is an acute stressor. When fasting becomes chronic and we just get hooked on fasting all the time, that's when it doesn't really have as much of an effect there. We still just kind of get the caloric restriction effect, but we don't get the shock, the wow factor that really allows us to activate those receptors and activate that fat more. I put a link down below for 20% off of the Create gummies. These are the creatine gummies that I use. They're 1 gram creatine monohydrate gummies. Now, the entire point behind Create was to sort of get rid of the stigma behind creatine in the first place. It's not just for building muscle. There's literature surrounding fat loss. There's literature surrounding brain performance. There's literature surrounding inflammation. There's a lot of data out there, and it's probably one of the most, if not the most, studied ergogenic aid that's out there. So no matter what your goal is, I can assure you there's an application for it. So that link down below is for 20% off the Create gummies. That link is in the top line of the description. Again, 20% off a bag of those gummies or however much you want. And the best thing about them is you can adjust your dose accordingly with 1 gram in the morning, 1 gram with lunch, 1 gram with dinner, maybe more. You can go all the way up to 10, 15 grams, whatever you really choose to do, and you can titrate that dose accordingly. So again, big thank you to Create, and that link is in the top line of the description. So our body has what's called the general adaptation system. Okay, and it's the job of the general adaptation system to adapt to a stressor. Fasting, no matter which way you spin it, is a stressor. Depriving ourselves of calories, that's a stressor. So the first response is going to be an acute fight or flight response. So the second that your body realizes, wait a minute, this guy's not feeding me. What's going on? You're gonna have this adrenaline spike that sort of shocks your body at first. And it's the job of that adrenaline to wake you up so that you go and hunt and find food, okay? Then the second phase is where your body sort of finds resistance, where it says, okay, I've adapted to this. I'm gonna go ahead and resolve the issue a little bit. We understand there's a stressor, but I'm gonna resolve it. Then there's the exhaustion phase, which is if you let it go too far, you end up in kind of this big issue of exhaustion where your body can't even keep up, but we're not going to talk about that one. Most of us, when we are intermittent fasting, we are kind of sitting in that resistance phase. We've had the acute stressor, and then we get adapted to intermittent fasting, and we continue on our merry lives because it's a great style of eating. It's a great eating pattern. I love intermittent fasting. But it has to continue to be this acute stressor if we want to have the effect of visceral fat being burned. Okay, since we have such a high concentration of beta-3 adrenergic receptors within our visceral fat, all we need is a quick spike of adrenaline to activate them. And because there's so many more receptors, because those glucocorticoid receptors are there, we don't need a long spike. One quick spike is enough to trigger. It's like a big lever. All we have to do is pull that lever one time really hard, and it's like almost more like a trebuchet or a catapult, and it's just going to signal that lipolysis to occur at the visceral fat level. But the moment that fasting becomes the norm, our adrenaline spike is not nearly as high. We still get it, don't get me wrong, but we have to start pushing it longer, or we have to start adding more exercise in to get that stressor out of it. And I think we forget that fasting shouldn't become easy. I mean, on one hand, we want it to be easy because it makes life easier, and I get that, but we also want it to be a stressor. It's like with high-intensity interval training. It's almost like you should think of your intermittent fasting as high-intensity interval fasting, because with training, you want to have a high-intensity spike and then recover. A high intensity spike and then recover. As a matter of fact, there was a study that was published in the journal Frontiers of Physiology that I talked about in a specific training video. That was just that. It was like subjects that did 6-second sprints ended up burning more visceral fat, or as much visceral fat, as people that were doing longer 3 or 4 minute intervals, but for longer periods of time. So basically, people that were sprinting for 20 minutes, just in an interval fashion, versus people that were cycling at a higher sort of intensity for 47 minutes, the sprinters, because the intensity was so much more high in the acute 6-second phase, their adrenaline spikes were higher. I want you to think of your fasting in that category too. Your fasting should be difficult. So what do you do in between your fasting then? Well, in between the days that you're not fasting, you should be eating relatively normal. Maybe follow a healthy eating pattern that you want to do. Maybe it's keto, paleo, vegan, vegetarian, I don't care. But your calories should be relatively normal so that the intermittent fasting is the shock to the system and continues to spike your adrenaline nice and high. That being said, lower, more sustained spikes of adrenaline, like more kind of a gentle bell curve, those can have a powerful effect on subcutaneous fat, just not as much on visceral fat, okay? So if you wanted to do like periodic fasting where you went a little bit longer, where you're not getting this just intense adrenaline spike, sure, that's still going to be great for fat loss. But remember, the biggest lever that we could possibly pull is by having these short, intense bouts. And now 16 hours of fasting, when you first start fasting, feels like an eternity. It feels long, right? You feel hungry, you feel pretty darn starving, and you feel like you're actually burning fat. Your tummy's rumbling, you feel fatigued, and a lot of that is a result of just, yes, your body is in shock. One of the things that we also have to look at is, because visceral fat is so close to the liver, if you do fasting periodically and you just allow it to be a shock, those fatty acids can liberate from the visceral fat, and they actually are closer to the liver because the visceral fat is right there, and they can go to the liver and they can form ketones even faster. So because you're doing this as an acute stressor, you have the ability to knock yourself into a ketogenic state within your fast a little bit better. So there's some interesting people out there that will say like intermittent fasting can have a negative effect on visceral fat. A lot of times what it can do is it can actually allow fat to go through sort of a staging area of visceral fat first, because that staging area of visceral fat is so much closer to the liver. It's easier, if your body gets adapted to fasting, to sort of liberate fat from the visceral fat to be used as fuel. So don't get that misconstrued with your body like storing visceral fat. It's just kind of, you can have that liberation occurring from the visceral fat first and then potential sort of deposition there afterwards. But it doesn't mean you're storing fat there in the long term. I did a separate video on that as well. So when it comes down to it at the end of the day, you need to make sure that fasting remains the anomaly. Do what you can as soon as fasting starts getting easy to make fasting difficult again, whether that means adding some exercise intensity to it or taking some time off. I periodically will take 2 weeks off of fasting so that I allow my body to restore and get the adrenaline effect. I want the stressor, and so should you. I'll see you tomorrow.